10 years after 3/11 녹음 1일차 시작하겠습니다. 청크컷입니다.
The Lessons of Fukushima.
The Lessons of Fukushima.
Nuclear power must be well run, not ditched.
Nuclear power must be well run, not ditched.
It has been 10 years
It has been 10 years
since a tsunami laid waste the Pacific coast of North Honshu.
since a tsunami laid waste the Pacific coast on the northern Honshu,
Japan's most populous island.
Japan's most populous island.
The tsunami and the undersea earthquake which triggered it,
The tsunami and the undersea earthquake which triggered it,
the largest ever recorded in the region, killed nearly 20,000 people, destroyed over 100,000 homes, and threw the lives of tens of millions into turmoil. The direct economic cost, estimated at over $200 billion,
The direct economic cost, which is estimated at over
was
$200
larger
billion,
than that of any other natural disaster the world has seen.
which is larger than that of any other natural disaster the world has seen.
And yet, for many around the world, the event is remembered for just one thing. The ensuing crisis at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant.
The ensuing crisis at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant.
The earthquake cut the plant off from outside sources of electricity.
The earthquake cut the
The earthquake cut the plant off from outside sources of electricity.
The earthquake cut the plant off from outside sources of electricity.
The tsunami easily topped the plant's seawalls. Flooding the underground bunkers containing its emergency generators.
Flooding the
underground bunkers containing its emergency generators. A foreseeable risk Japan's neutered regulators had failed to foresee. Because there was no way to cool the reactor cores, the nuclear fuel within them began to melt. Amid fire, explosion, and alarming amounts of radiation, a puddle from hell began eating into the plant's concrete foundations. The world looked on aghast. In Shanghai and San Francisco, iodine tablets and iodized salt jumped off the shelves. As people looked for prophylaxis of which they had no need. In Germany, the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, who had long stood with business leaders against the country's powerful anti-nuclear movement, ordered its reactors phased out. In China, the world's largest new nuclear plant program was put on hold. Talk of a nuclear renaissance to fight climate change fell silent.
to fight against the climate change fell silent.
The reaction, though understandable, was wrong.
The reaction, though understandable, was wrong.
Nuclear power has a lot of drawbacks.
Nuclear power has a lot of drawbacks.
Its large, slowly built plants are expensive.
Its large, slowly built plants are expensive.
Both in absolute terms and in terms of the electricity they produce.
Both in absolute terms and in terms of electricity it produces.
Its very small but real risk of catastrophic failure.
Its very small but real risk of catastrophic failure
requires a high level of regulation.
Acquires a high level of regulation.
And it has a disturbing history of regulatory capture.
And it has a disturbing history of regulatory capture.
Amply demonstrated in Japan.
Amply demonstrated in Japan.
It produces extremely long-lived and toxic waste.
It produces extremely long-lived and toxic wastes.
And it is associated with the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
And it is associated with the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Most of the countries outside Europe that use nuclear power have some history of attempting to develop a bomb. All these factors contribute to an unease with the technology. Felt to greater or lesser extent by people all around the world.
From all over around the world.
Against that, though, two things must be remembered. One is that well-regulated nuclear power is safe. With the terrible Soviet-era exception of Chernobyl. Nuclear disasters come without large death tolls. It was the tsunami, not radiation. That claimed nearly all those lives in Fukushima. The other is that the climate is in crisis. And nuclear plants can supply some of the vast amounts of emissions-free electricity. The world needs, if it is to cope. Solar and wind power are now much cheaper, but they are intermittent.
Solar and wind power are now much cheaper, but they are intermittent.
Providing a reliable grid is a lot easier.
Is much easier.
If some of its generating capacity can be assumed to be available all the time. Nuclear provides such capacity with no ongoing emissions.
Nuclear provides such capacity without an ongoing emission.
And it is doing so safely and at scale around the world.
All around the world.
Despite this, safe and productive nuclear plants are being closed across the rich world.
Despite this, safe and productive nuclear plants are being closed across the rich world. Those closures and the retirement of older sites mean that advanced economies could lose 2/3 of their nuclear capacity by 2040. Means that advanced countries could lose 2/3 of their.
According to the International Energy Agency. IEA.
If new fossil fuel infrastructure fills the gap.
If new fossil fuel infrastructure fills the gap.
It will last for decades.
It will last for decades.
If renewables do so.
If renewables do so.
The opportunity cost will be measured in gigatons of carbon.
The opportunity cost will be
carbon.
The opportunity cost will
The opportunity cost will be measured in gigatons of carbon.
The opportunity cost will be measured in gigatons of carbon.
Renewables replacing nuclear capacity.
Renewables replacing nuclear capacity
would almost always be better deployed to replace fossil fuel capacity.
Would almost always be deployed than what?
Sometimes the closure of nuclear plants is largely a matter of economics.
Sometimes the closure of nuclear plants are largely an area of economics.
In places where emitting carbon dioxide comes with no price, such as America.
In places where carbon dioxide emissions comes at no price, such as America.
The benefits of being emissions-free are hidden from the market.
The benefits for being emissions-free are hidden from the market.
That hurts nuclear, and it should be rectified.
That hurts nuclear and should be rectified.
When closure is political, the onus is on green politicians in particular.
When closure is political, the onus is on the green politicians
to change their tune.
In particular, to change the tune.
To hasten the decline of nuclear power.
To hasten the decline of nuclear power.
Is willfully to hobble the world in the greatest environmental. Is willfully to hobble the world in the greatest environmental struggle of all. Is willfully to hobble the world in the greatest environmental struggle of all.
Is willfully to hobble. 이거 다시 아예 안 들립니다.
Is willfully to hobble the world in the greatest environmental struggle of all.
Is willfully to hobble the world environmentally around the world.
The argument for keeping existing nuclear plants. The argument for keeping existing nuclear plants open.
The argument for keeping existing nuclear plants open
has been strengthened in some places. By one of the responses to Fukushima. Greater independence for nuclear regulators.
Greater independence for nuclear regulators.
Britain granted new freedom to its regulators after 2011.
Britain granted new independence to its regulators after 2007.
So did Japan. Though grander hopes for reform after the tsunami bore little fruit.
Bore little fruit.
Japan did largely take the regulator's hand. From the power company's glove. Its new supervisor has made reopening mothballed nuclear power plants. Its new supervisor made reopening mothballed nuclear power plants harder than the government would like. But that is as it should be. In Japan more than anywhere. Nuclear needs to earn back trust to be useful.
Nuclear needs to earn back trust from the useful.
This points to nuclear's greatest weakness. In democracies, it is expensive, owing to regulation and public antipathy. In democracies, it is expensive to earn public antipathy.
In democracies, it is expensive to earn owing to regulation and public antipathy. In democracies, it is expensive owing to regulation and public antipathy.
Which makes new nuclear power a hard sell.
which makes new nuclear power a hard sell.
The technology is thus increasingly the preserve of autocracies.
The technology is thus increasingly the preserve of autocracies.
Precisely the systems where good regulation is least likely.
Precisely where systems of regulation are least likely.
Having paused after Fukushima, China's nuclear plans accelerated as part of an effort to reduce reliance on coals. China produced 4 times as much nuclear energy in 2019.
China produced as much as four times of nuclear plant in 2019
as it did in 2011. It has 16 reactors under construction and another 39 planned.
It has 16
and another
reactors.
It has 16 reactors under construction and another 39 planned.
It has 16 reactors under construction and another 39 planned.
Countries wanting new nuclear plants now look to China and Russia as suppliers. There is a strong case for democracies seeking to replace aging nuclear plants with non-intermittent equivalents.
Seeking aging nuclear plants with to join the importers. If Chinese reactors are designed in the knowledge that they will have to meet with the approval of independent regulators, the world will be a safer place. At the same time, in boosting energy R&D to tackle the climate crisis, Western governments should be sure to give nuclear its fair share. Western governments should be sure enough to give a fair share.
There are real attractions to some new approaches. Notably smaller reactors with lower unit costs. In platoons they can replace old plants. Singly, they can add incremental capacity where needed.
Singly, they can add incremental capacity when they are needed.
They might perhaps be used to retrofit old fossil fuel plants.
They might perhaps be used to retrofit old fossil fuel plants. Nuclear power has drawbacks the size of a tsunami. But with Chinese plants being built today that will not be decommissioned until the 22nd century, it cannot simply be wished away. What is more, it has a vital role to play in the fight for a stable climate. The lesson of Fukushima is not to eschew nuclear power. It is to use it wisely. 끝났습니다.